Hey guys, this is Andrea Lynn, and a few weeks ago I spoke with Stephen Clouse. He is a political philosophy professor. That is an amazing alliteration, by the way. And he was just a font of knowledge. I think I continued chatting with him for like hours after because there's so many things. So many things. We covered so much of great depth in this episode. We go from what is virtue, what was it to the ancients, and what is it to the founding fathers, and what is it to us now. And we also do the same with freedom, and we look quite a bit at democracy and liberty and what the maybe pitfalls of some of these things are and what the virtues of these things are. Anyway, it's really an excellent talk, guys. I loved it. I love chatting with Stephen. He is a powerhouse of information. Guys, watch the whole thing. Like really, it's so good. Anyway, here we are. Here's Stephen. Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
Thanks for chatting with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, can we just start off with what your specialty is?
Sure. I study political philosophy. My primary study or my primary area is in ancient Greek political thought, and I suppose my secondary is in American political thought.
Oh, okay. And how did you, are those linked?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay. I was like, there's like a couple millennia between those.
Right. Yeah. No. So, I guess I'll do the fastest version of this that any specialist in their area can do.
Okay.
So yeah, they're definitely connected because the things in the ancient world, they were asking questions, or they're the first ones in the Western tradition anyway, and really in any tradition that I know of, that ask questions of what does it mean to be free? What does the rule of law mean relative to the people who are governed? Under the broad scope of republicanism, the rule of law, and modern political thought picks that back up from antiquity. And the American tradition is the one, or the way in which I approach it is the clearest form of testing that that has emerged. Mm-hmm. So it's a tradition that's asking questions of how are we supposed to govern ourselves? What does it mean to have freedom? What is equality?
And they both do that? That's the sort of common thread between the two?
Yeah, the whole tradition sort of asks that or engages with that. And the difference is the American answer or the modern answer, I think the things are very similar, is in some ways a continuation, but in a lot of ways a rejection of the ancient one. So if I'm going to understand the modern one, I have to know what it's rejecting. So that's how I connect the two of them. Or that's how I think the two of them are connected.
Okay, well, what are they rejecting then?
Oh, this is going to be a very long talk.
Oh, no. Okay. See, I'm just like, I do have a few things I want to ask you specifically. So this is my curiosity getting.
No, it's good. No, it's good. The biggest thing is the difference is, do the citizens of a country need to be virtuous or not? Is probably the biggest difference between them. Where in the ancient world, virtue is considered to be incredibly important. Virtue understood not necessarily as being moral, but being excellent. And that there's an excellence that comes along with being a citizen, where in the modern world, it's about rules, what kinds of rules are necessary to govern people's behaviors, not so much how do we create better people, how do we create the appropriate laws to regulate people's behaviors, how do we make good systems. This broadly falls under the trend of liberalism. That's really sort of the underlying structure of liberal political thought. And it's a challenge to the older Republican idea.
But I can see positives and negatives in the wanting to have virtuous people, because on the one hand, you can't force people to be virtuous.
Right.
But on the other hand, it seems better than rules and systems, the desire to make your citizens virtuous. So
right. That's right. So A lot of this debate actually is really relevant to some of the popular um, writers, thinkers, people, I guess, today. Um, Steven Pinker's book about the Enlightenment really
Hmm.
takes on Rousseau as one of the big critics of the Enlightenment. And one of Rousseau's big ideas is that people, in essence, are forced to be free, that their state forces them to do this in this way. And in the way that the ancient world also, in some ways, forced their people to be free, but their understanding of freedom was different. Freedom was understood as um, the ability to self-regulate, not to pursue what you wanted. There's a book out by a professor at Notre Dame, Patrick Deneen, um, on why liberalism failed. That really does a really nice job of laying this out. It's really scathing in its assessment of liberalism, but he takes this on pretty head on, and it's a pretty good book for a popular audience. Um,
Okay, so why liberalism failed, like currently or back then?
yes,
You
it's why
you
he
mean
thinks
both? Like it failed
his
back then and now?
his argument is that liberalism, when it was sort of developed in the 16th century, because it was successful through time, has led to its failure. That liberalism was set up to fail the whole time. I don't agree with him. I don't agree with Deneen. I don't put myself in that camp, but it's certainly something that's worth thinking about. And his book lays this out really nicely.
Okay, so I do have some more questions, but I just need to put a pin in my future questions. Okay,
Sure.
liberalism did work, and because it worked so well, it is now failing. Can you explain what that? I guess it could be examples or
Yeah.
explain what that means.
Yeah. So his argument is, and I guess without getting trying not to get too technical, that liberalism as a political theory lays out the idea that the supremacy of the individual, the maximization of individual liberty, that's the name, that there's an idea of that there was a state of nature that people existed in before we created government, that government's
Mm-hmm.
created by the consent of the governed to maximize their natural rights or their liberty for as uh, and maintain as much equality as possible. What
That
Deneen
sounds
lays
right.
out,
Yeah.
yeah, what Deneen lays out, taking from a French writer in the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville, that um, there's a major tension between equality and liberty, and that the two things are like two magnets that you point at each other.
Mm.
That they're, you have to hold them in tension. And I think we probably can talk some about this too with Ben Shapiro's book,
Mm.
where he's dealing with a similar thing. I don't, in my perspective, not as well as Patrick Deneen does, but he's appealing to a different audience. The idea is that because of these inherent tensions, the biggest thing Deneen points to is that the other thing that liberalism does is it disconnects us from our nature, and it disconnects us from nature at large. And when you combine that with the modern scientific enterprise, science is about, for him, at least in the way he's framing it, and there's some truth to this as well. It's about conquering nature. It's about making sure that the limits we see in nature we can either overcome or use for our benefit. A really good example of this is, the use of viruses in immunotherapy treatments and this kind of stuff, to use viruses, reprogram them, and go after cancer cells. That's using nature for our benefit. It's not a limitation, right? But it's using nature to help us. Well, he points us to, well, the other thing, the use of nature would be like burning old dinosaurs to power all of our industry, and it's overcooking the planet. And so this may be a problem. So that's on the one side. Then on the other side, this leads us to the complete denial that there's any relationship between our biology and our psychology. And we see that play out a lot. This is where Jordan Peterson, has all of his stuff. And there's all that argument there on the left, the political left, I suppose. For Deneen, he's saying, well, they're both connected to the same problem, which is liberalism. And that's where I disagree with him. He goes further than I will go.
Okay, so he's saying that because we've become too free.
It's not too free. It's that the way in which we understand freedom is wrong. Um,
Oh,
And
Oh,
so he's wanting to say we need to go back again. This is that connection to the ancient world, to go back to one of those, or because he's not simple enough to think that we can just go backward.
of
It's that
course.
we need to look back and see what worked, and then in the future try to replicate the best parts that we can, understanding the circumstance that we're in.
Okay, I think you mentioned this before, but can you give what the definition of freedom is today versus freedom
Right.
of the what the ancients would say is
Yeah,
freedom?
yeah. So there's a bit more contention over that, at least like in the literature. But so I won't bore you with that, or you or the people who are going to listen.
Okay.
But so the sort of the useful thing, I guess we could say, modern freedom is a freedom we can use. There was a political scientist in the 20th century that laid this out, Isaiah Berlin, that there's sort of positive freedom and negative freedom, the freedom to do something versus the freedom from something.
Okay.
The argument is that modern liberal freedom, or liberal liberty, is the freedom from restriction or limitation. Um, that you want to be liberated from any constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Where in the ancient world, the idea of liberty was the freedom to behave in a certain way.
Oh.
Right? That you had the freedom to exercise, you had the freedom to be virtuous, or you had the freedom to be courageous. You had the freedom to self-regulate,
That
or
sounds like really
self-sufficiency.
good to me.
Yeah, it's well, Christianity picks up on it, and it carries through in Christian political thought through to the present. There's a lot of that that's in there, and this is where Shapiro picks up on it too. That you have the
Okay.
freedom to follow certain rules, and by following those rules, it makes you free.
Okay. Oh, like the truth will set you free.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
actually have looked at the Greek, the original Greek, and it's not set, it's make. Like the truth will make you free. So it's kind
Hmm.
of relates to what you were saying. Okay, that actually brings me to one of my first questions was I consulted you about I made a little short video a few weeks ago about after Notre Dame burned. Ben was talking about a few things that people didn't respond super well to, and it just brought me. I think he's talking about going back to our the best way we could honor, Notre Dame's memory is to return to our Judeo-Christian roots or something like that. And
Right.
so I decided to like look into what his book was about. That's actually just the catalyst for me looking back at what his book is saying and sort of the thesis of his book. And I didn't 100% agree with it. And so, yeah, I asked you about what you thought about it. And yeah, I think that you came up with like mythos versus logos and that we can't
Yep.
just point to one. And
Hmm.
so if you by mythos versus logos, maybe what is the other? You gave me a few. Oh, Athens and Jerusalem.
Yep.
Those
Yeah.
tensions. So if you could, sorry, could you actually talk about Shapiro's book? Because you actually have read it and reviewed it, and I haven't read it. I just know the idea of what
Yeah.
is the theme. But if you could go over that.
Sure. Sure. And yeah, I'll do I guess a Cliff Notes version here or something.
Mm-hmm.
My full review is on Areo magazine's website if anybody wants to check it out. So Shapiro's book lays out that in essence there are two traditions that sit at the heart of the Western tradition, which is the tradition that comes from Athens, which we call the Logos or reason, and that the other one comes from Jerusalem, which is the mythos, or revelation. Reason, revelation, Logos and mythos, Athens and Jerusalem. All of those things can be used in some ways interchangeably in this context. Obviously, not in every context, but in this one, they can be used in some ways interchangeably. And the tension is the most useful one is between that reason and revelation. How much can the human mind come to understand our place in the universe's place in us, versus how much do we have to have revealed to us by something that's not human,
Okay.
right? Something that's divine. And Shapiro's argument is, in essence, that both of those things are essential for the Western tradition, that you have to have both the reason and the revelation working together in tension, in harmony, but in some way together. Where I criticize Mr. Shapiro is he leaves out the part, or glazes over, I should say, more than leaves out, the fact that those two things really are at tension with each other. Like if you combine the words together, it's a mythology, right? Mythos and logos, it's mythology,
yeah. Oh,
right?
yeah,
And
totally.
and because both of those words at their core are talking about speech, because for something that's a mythos means to be related by talking, when it goes all the way back etymologically, and logos is the same thing. It means to talk, words or speech or reason. All of those things are connected. So there are really two kinds of ways of talking about the way we speak, and
Oh,
so
wow.
when you put them together, when you're talking about mythology, it's the sort of the account of the things that we talk about, is the way in which that word is going to break down. There's a tension in the Western tradition on this, and that tension really, in some ways, we can attribute going back to Plato, to his teacher, to Socrates. Sort of that's the beginning of political philosophy, and his criticism of the poets, of Homer and of his children, right? And because the argument is, well, the revelation isn't necessarily true. Well, how do you reconcile those things? And that's been the tension that's come down to us through the ages. There have been a bunch of attempts to try to reconcile them. The most famous one in the Christian tradition is Thomas Aquinas, to put together Aristotle and Christianity, which mucks both of them up, but we don't need to go into that. and then it comes up to the present, where I think you see this debate in some ways between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. They're really arguing in the same way, where Peterson is sort of going, no, the stories really matter. They're in some ways the heart of the enterprise. And Harris is, well, the stories are nice, but what's really important is scientific reasoning, that's the important thing. Shapiro's tapping into that, recognizing the thing, but ultimately where he ends up falling is more in the camp of revelation, which is completely unsurprising because he's Orthodox.
Yes.
Right? So it makes sense. And I don't want to completely discount him. I mean, I'm a little more critical of him in the review, which I think is warranted. Which is why I wrote it. He likes to glaze over those tensions. To me, it's the tension that's the most important part of those elements, that they can't be reconciled together, that both of them may be essential, and we really run the risk of damaging the civilization if we abandon one or the other.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, because, yeah, so what I have seen is people like Shapiro and I suppose, like you said, the Revelation camp, where they really stress the importance of the Judeo-Christian. And I even looked that up, that it's, or read an article about it, that Judeo-Christian is a new concept, like, from the 30s, around World 30s, World War II. But I know what he means. He means, Jews and Christians, basically, but it's just, whatever. But but that sort of thought, that thought is why we are so great in the West. And it's not, I'm going to use a double negative. It's negative there. It's not because of it, but it, it's not only, to me, it seems like playing a what if game where you try to tease out, well, if we do, let's just take one part and forget the rest of the cultural climate, because you can't take away nationalities of certain Enlightenment individuals. You can't take away that they were pushing back against the church. So in a way, we needed the church for them to push back against. Like, it just seems like there are, it's what we call, nuance. And I mean, it's not like Ben Shapiro doesn't understand nuance, but he just focuses on what he seems to like the best, is what it seems.
Well, he's a polemicist at its core.
Okay.
Right, or at least that's the way I view Shapiro. That's what the name of the article is, that there's more heat than light here.
Okay.
That there's more about, it's about rallying the troops, so to speak. And I suppose that the credit that I do give him is in the audience that he's appealing to, he's at least pointing them to make them read this stuff. And to me, that's, even if you get the interpretations wrong, if you encourage people to actually go back and read it, then that may be the
That's
most useful thing that comes out of it.
yeah.
Um, but like, for example, taking up Christianity is in the first sort of attempt to reconcile Greek philosophy with the Jewish revelation,
Mm.
and it creates its own thing.
Hmm.
So to say Judeo-Christian and Athens already is causing a problem, because that's sort of like double dipping into the Greek tradition,
Oh,
because it's
because
already built into Christianity.
oh, I do remember because I took Christian history. I've
Mhm.
mentioned that to you before, but that we didn't really focus on Aquinas though. That's the funny thing. In
Yeah.
philosophy we did, but not really in the history. I don't know.
Sure. Though you even get it before you get to Aquinas, in St. Augustine in the very early church, he's,
Right.
using Plato. Plato's
Right.
everything. Plato has this figure. And Marx even says this. Marx says of Christianity that it's Plato for the masses. And
Right.
so there's something that's already going on there, which I guess is an entirely sort of different, more technical discussion that I think we want to jump into tonight.
Right.
But the that's already sort of part of the built-in problem here, because Christianity opens a lot of problems in that reason versus revelation conflict. It's actually in some ways why I think philosophy is more dangerous to Christianity than it is to Judaism or to Islam,
Oh,
because
how so?
like Christianity doesn't have a moral code that's been given to you. It's Judaism, 613, if I remember my Judaism correctly, 613 laws that you have to follow, right? And it's not because you want to, it's because God says so. And so how are you going to spend your Tuesday? Doing this stuff. There are certain things you can't do on the Sabbath, certain kinds of work you can't do. You can't pick up sticks, you can't start a fire, this kind of stuff. Christianity doesn't have any of that, or very, very little of it. So what you have to do is, in some ways, lay out dogmas to
Mm-hmm.
understand this. And so we have to create certain practices that are attached to Christianity that's different than Judaism or Islam. Well, how do you justify that stuff? Well, a lot of it's through human reasoning. How do we fit in? How do we sort of use this understanding of God as man and his example to construct our understanding of how to be human beings? Well, philosophy can really undermine all of that in a way that don't eat pork is pretty simple, right? Don't eat anything from a
Mm.
cleft hoof, right?
Yeah.
Philosophy is not going to really be able to mess with that. It's pretty
Yeah.
black and white, right? Where Christianity doesn't have that stuff. So it's a fraught tension, a
Oh,
big
because
tension.
what I'm thinking of is like take up your cross and follow me.
Hmm.
What does that look like?
Right, right. No,
Right?
well, and I think the most challenging thing that Christianity commands is to love your enemy. Um,
Yes, yeah.
it
Bless
how
those who curse you. Yeah.
Right. It's the most, what a command to take something in the abstract. People think, oh, whatever, this is really sort of benign. We think it's incredibly benign today because we've had it for 2,000 years. But if you really think about someone that's caused you harm, the thing you want to do is have retribution, and
Mm.
to say, no, 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 to show them charity, right?
Mm.
To experience things with them. That's really hard.
Well,
Um,
yes. Yeah. Well, I think everyone watching can relate in some ways. So that
yeah,
actually brings my other question because we've talked about sort of Ben Shapiro amongst other not just it's not just him. It's conservative orthodox religious individuals
sure.
would gravitate towards that. Now, on the other side, we have the I'd say pretty staunch atheist camp
Hmm.
where I'm thinking of like the new atheist movement, I suppose, where it's like that's nonsense.
Hmm.
Stories are great, and that's why they're stories. Like let's leave
Hmm.
them there, like what you mentioned with the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson sort of
Yeah,
uh, debate, I suppose.
right.
And to be honest, I okay because I follow Jesus. I have a faith there. I'm not quite as staunchly conservative as say someone like Ben Shapiro, which is I am fine with looking at the historical context and whatnot. Perhaps I'm not. What did you say? He was a polemicist.
Yeah,
I'm
that's what
not.
I would.
I'm not that right.
Yeah.
But if I look through a sort of atheist lens, I'm like, yeah, why? Why? How do we reconcile that? And I don't.
Mhm.
That's what I want to ask you because,
Oh
like,
boy.
why would no? But like, but if why? Actually, no, you know this because okay, with you mentioned to me in the past about your dissertation might be about Aristotle and
Yep.
why he includes the gods in his writings when he
Yeah.
didn't really believe in them.
Yeah. So yeah, that's actually a really interesting way to combine those things. What I'm working on, or my first chapter, I suppose, is asking that question: what are the things? Why are they there?
Mm,
Especially when, and I guess if you'll let me like do a minute here just to set some of this up, I suppose,
I will
like
let you.
the way that the ancient Greeks understood the pantheon of the gods, these aren't like superheroes. They're real, right? You're doing sacrifices and you're doing these kinds of things. But then you also have a festival every year that gets set up in the fifth century where these are characters who you can see being acted out by people.
Hmm.
And Aristotle in his work on this, on the Poetics, doesn't really give the gods. I don't really know why they're here, other than they're here because the context in which we exist puts them here. Sort of that he ends up saying it's sort of the bias of the audience.
Mm.
That you're using the culture that you're in to tell the stories you can tell in the culture that you're in. So if you're in a culture that worships Zeus, well, the stories about the gods are going to include Zeus. Um, if you don't have stories about the gods, you don't have to include them. But if you do, if you're going to have things where there are supernatural elements, well, you use the bias of your time, whatever it may be. I think that's the best thing I've come to, or argument for why that's there. Um, the reason I think that this is the case, do you watch any of the superhero movies or any
Oh
of those
yes, I
things?
do. Yeah, I
Right.
just watched Endgame last week, so
Oh, it
yeah.
wrecked me when I watched that movie. It tore me up. It was a good movie. It tore me up.
No
Or
spoilers here. No
yeah,
spoilers.
no. Go watch
Yeah.
those. Or Game of Thrones. Do you watch any of that?
Yeah. Oh,
So
I'm all in. I'm all in,
so
Stephen.
terrific. So like things in Game of Thrones is even better. I think a better example. Like there are things that can't exist there. That's why it's fantasy, right?
Hmm.
Dragons and ice zombies and this kind of stuff, right? And Aristotle says that we will have a much easier time believing things are impossible than things that are improbable. So I can accept that dragons can exist and that the White Walkers can do what they can do, or there's gods from Asgard that have hammers and can take a star in the chest and all the rest of this stuff.
Yeah.
These are impossible things. What I can't do is when you show me something that I know basically can't happen, where you rewrite the rules of gravity or something without explaining it. I can't accept improbable things like how do people travel the distance of 500 miles in 30 minutes? Right? The Star Trek thing. We're going to warp between planets on the commercial break, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you go, well, we need it to for the story. That's why, right?
Hmm.
And he goes, well, it creates plot holes.
Hmm.
And that's a problem for stories anytime there's a plot hole because it takes you out of the action of the story. And what the introduction of the gods can do is take you out of the story. So you have to integrate them in a way where they don't do that. I think, for example, like the Oedipus story, I think everybody knows the Oedipus story, right? If at the end, instead of him having the great tragic moment where his mom kills himself or herself and he takes out his eyes of it, if Hermes came down and went, ha, 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 we're just spoofing all you guys, isn't this funny, right? That would be horrible. No one would enjoy that story at all. It wouldn't have endured. There wouldn't be anything that was emotionally resonant about it because we would just be these playthings of the gods and that would suck, right? What would be the point of this? So it would undo the whole benefit of the story if that were the case. And this, I think you can see, sort of working out in these archetypal stories, with Jung and all the rest of this, where the stories have to have resonance to human beings as they are human beings.
Hmm.
If it just becomes something where stories are, you have no control in your life, nothing you do matters, you're a slave to the gods, well, what's the point of this? And if that's
Oh.
the story that's going to take you there. So for Aristotle, his criticism is, or at least the argument that I'm making, is that uh, the gods are necessary for telling certain kinds of stories because you want certain kinds of outcomes. And you don't have to. Endgame's a really good example. It took 10 years to get there. That couldn't have been the first movie. You can tell that story because you have 10 years of stuff lighting up behind it.
Hmm.
Well, if you can do that with this, you can do the same thing with religion. And if that's across the entire culture, now I can tell you all kinds of stories about the kids of Moses or of Abraham or these things that you're familiar with. And I can tell you stories about those characters without having to give you a introductory movie, so to speak. Um, right?
Oh,
Does
so
that
it's
make
like
any sort of
taking,
sense?
yeah, it's like taking you along. I guess it's like growing with you almost.
Well, there's a foundation that's already there that you don't have to set up. Um,
Right.
there are certain things you can assume your audience will already believe, um,
Right.
and that's really necessary for good storytelling.
Okay.
Well, like for example, um, if your culture doesn't have a bias against killing your parents, then the stories of the ancient Greeks don't make a lot of sense. Like patricide is one of the worst things that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if that's not the case, which would be a really odd place to live, I suppose, but if that's not the case, then it's not going to be emotionally resonant when you kill your father. You're just going to go, oh, well, of course you do that, right?
Right.
It's not going to be tragic. Um, so I think that's what he's talking about, that those things are connected to um, the culture and that the culture develops out of those things.
So it's connected to the culture, and the culture grows out of that as well.
Hmm.
So it's almost like a feedback loop.
Well, so and I guess I want to I'll shift gears here and bring in Nietzsche because he
Okay.
ruins everything, but I think he's useful here. Um, uh, Someone like Dawkins has talked about how, and you even get this from even like Stephen Fry or so the new atheist sort of guys, where I find the poetry really moving, or I find the music incredibly moving, or the artwork is incredibly moving. And Nietzsche's criticism is, well, but that is the religion. Um,
The
those things can't be
moving.
disconnected. Well, no,
Mm.
the music and its
Oh,
the
okay.
reverence that's built into it, and that those things that if you disconnect those things from the sort of the religious structure, or Nietzsche's concern is with this anyway, um, they won't have the resonance. They won't be valuable. You won't see them as anything other than um, nice sounds in a nice order. They won't have anything special about them. There will be no way to make a distinction between holy or reverent music and, like, I don't know, Justin Bieber. Um, it'll all just be the same. Um,
Right. But we
and
know
that
it's not the same. Like we know inside it's not the same. And that's kind of what you're saying.
Well, and but for someone like someone like Nietzsche, the reason that you know that it's not is because there's still the religious underpinnings that are there.
Mm.
If you go, like, if you read Zarathustra and it's the crazy mountain man coming down, running around grabbing people, yelling on God's dead, and it's like this guy's a lunatic. Um, it's not good. He's not like, yes, I'm so glad, right? No, he's incredibly distraught. Like, haven't you guys heard that God's dead and this everything is chaos now, right? Like, this is
Okay.
it's pandemonium, because all of this stuff goes away if it all falls apart. If for Nietzsche anyway, that
Mm.
and that's where I think a lot of these guys, whether it's Shapiro or it's Harris, these guys, both of them don't take Nietzsche seriously enough, because he's scathing against that conservative position. Like, he calls Judaism and Christianity the morality of slaves.
Mm.
Like, he's not saving them. But on
Mm.
the other side, he is not saying atheism is going to lead to a better world. He's far worried that it's not going to. That what we'll end up doing is creating something that could be just as ruinous or more ruinous than anything that preceded it. Um,
Well, we
because
have the 20th century to prove that he was right.
Right, or yes, and some people certainly attribute that to him, um, and I don't know how I fall onto that.
Yeah, what do you think?
I can see where the logic where it takes you to see that. Um, I think the 20th century is an attempt. It's human beings creating an example or a condition for themselves that they don't know what they're doing.
Hmm.
Like, all of the progress outpaced our ability to understand the progress. And so we didn't particularly understand the ramifications of what we were doing. Like all of us today live in the afterglow of the Nazis. It's why they're the only big bad evil that anyone can ever talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if I don't like you, you're a Nazi.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
right? Because the only evil that's left. And even you go, well, why were they evil? Right? Because we're bad. I don't know. Or they killed a lot of people. Well,
Yeah.
Stalin killed a lot of people. Mao
Yeah.
killed people. Lots of people have killed lots of people.
Yeah.
It can't just be the death count. There's got to be something more. And so I think I don't really know. I've thought about it. I'm not in a position to give you an articulate answer on that. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I think I'm fine to just off the top of your head, because I that's what I'm doing right now, is off the top of my head.
There's the argument that it's the atheist regimes. That's one of the interpretations. That communism and Nazism are fundamentally atheist regimes that led to the destruction of this. And that's not true. That's not
Okay.
that's not accurate. I would say that is overly simplified.
Okay.
Like fascism rises in Italy out of the far right portion of the Catholics, right? It's not as though that there was no relationship between the faith and fascism, and communism.
Oh yeah, Marxism though. I thought there wasn't. I thought there was like an atheist.
Right.
Base.
So, but the argument is, or at least the one that I think is forces you to wrestle with is, well, you've just replaced God with the state.
Yes.
And that the real problem is the slavish devotion to any one thing. And that's sort of the takeaway. The problem is the totalitarian nature of any ideology.
Okay.
And that really is the sort of the lesson we should take out of the 20th century, which is also the lesson I think you should take out of Plato's Republic. That the problem is the tyrannical pursuit of anything is always going to produce a tyrant.
Right.
You can't, that's why the idea that excess or extremism in the pursuit of virtue is no vice. No, by its nature it is. You can't use a vice to get to virtue.
Right.
Or for someone like Plato, though that's not what like modern economics believes. Modern economics is you can take selfishness and set everybody on their selfish course, and you're going to get public goods that come out of that selfishness. This is in Mandeville. This is and the guy that picks up on Adam Smith, right, in The Wealth of Nations. That's really the underlying argument. We don't need people to be good to have them produce good things.
And do you agree with that?
I don't know. It's an idea that we have to wrestle with, because in one way it's worked.
That's what I was thinking.
We're having a conversation here across national borders and across time zones in real time.
Yeah.
Because it worked.
Yeah.
But does that mean that it necessarily leads us to the best way that human beings could live? I don't think so, or at least I'm not sure. But it's an idea we have to wrestle with. What is the relationship between private vice and public virtue? This is something I wish, like, I watched a couple of the interviews you've had with people talking about the IDW. I just watched the one you did with Iona Italia.
Yeah.
And she's really lovely.
Yeah.
From the interactions I've had with her, she's really lovely. Where you guys talked about, is the IDW a group, or is it a way of thinking? Or is it sort of an attempt at a counterculture against the major culture, right? These things. And I haven't thought enough about them to have an answer on that. But what I will say is I wish the IDW had someone that wasn't either a lawyer or a psychologist.
Okay, why do you say that?
Because of the way that you approach. So psychology at its core is trying to understand individuals and then how individuals relate to each other in a certain structure. Or, I mean, you can do social psychology and you can even do political psychology. That's usually more in a political science department. You're not approaching it in the way that sort of I do, and I guess this is sort of self-serving. But I wish there were, there are certainly people, public intellectuals, who are political philosophers, who don't think about things in terms of human psychology, but think about things in terms of the history of ideas. How have these arguments related to one another? And how are we supposed to deal with the gaps between them?
Okay.
And I wish someone in that group did more of that.
Can you explain gaps between them?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So the example, the Smith example we were just talking about, private vice and public virtue. And I guess I'll double this back to the very first thing we were talking about in my specialization. What's the
Right.
connection between modernity and the ancient world? Well,
Mm.
there's another really good example of the gap. Like Aristotle or Cicero. Cicero is really good on this one. Um, there is no way that private vice can lead to anything but public vice, right? If you have bad people, you're going to have a bad country. Or if you cultivate bad people, you're going to have a bad people.
That kind of
Um,
makes sense. Yeah.
and where the modern example or the modern argument is the public vices cancel each other out, and what's left over is the public good.
Can you give an example?
Well, I can give you where the argument, or one of the clearest examples of this argument is from. In American thought, the Federalist Papers, which give the
Alexander
argument,
Hamilton. Yep.
Hamilton and Madison and John Jay. The clearest example of this is in Federalist number 51,
Okay.
where Publius, who we attribute it to Madison, but Publius, the author, argues that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. We need to set people's personal vices against one another, and we're going to set government up in the same way. So, for example, today, the big fight between the Trump administration and Congress, people keep calling it a constitutional crisis. No, this is what the Constitution was set up to do. When there's an excess in one area, the other place balances and checks it by fighting against it, setting one institutional ambition against another institutional ambition.
Okay.
But ambition is not good, right? It leads to vices. It's not inherently a good thing. That changes in modernity from the ancient world, because what we really mean by ambition there is greed, selfishness, and that this is a big problem in the ancient world, where you think you're more important than anybody else who's around you. And the modern argument is, but I mean modern, not mine, ours being modern, is no, we can always rely on people to be selfish, so we should use it as the foundation for our government. We can't rely on people to be good, but we can always rely on them to be selfish.
And that's our foundation?
Right, or yeah, pretty close to it anyway. In a very narrow, very quick breakdown,
Okay.
perhaps an oversimplification.
So how has capitalism worked? Because that kind of seems like I know capitalism is economic and not government, and we were just talking about government, but it is sort of intertwined.
Yeah,
Ish.
no question.
And it does seem like we're talking about greed. Well, competition,
Right.
that seems to work though. And
Yes.
and I'm not sure how to, back to the Congress thing about like the ambitions kind of checking each other, like kind of going against and pushing pull. That's the idea. That's why it would work.
Right.
But why? What checks it then? If it's not one another.
So what is it? What checks
The greed, I guess, or the ambition,
yeah.
like you said.
Yeah. So how does it work in sort of capitalism? This is a bit out of my study, right? But
Okay.
I'll take a shot in the dark on this. The thing that checks it is someone else's. That ultimately, like Smith's sort of notion is that you have to have a government that has rules, right? So that certain things aren't permissible, and you have to have this. But for the most part, sort of the idea of the invisible hand will guide things. Now, for him, that invisible hand, everybody goes to The Wealth of Nations, which is that book that if you drop it on your pet, it'll kill it, right? There's one that he wrote about 20 years earlier called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he argues that everyone has a natural moral sentiment to connect to one another, that morality and markets have to go together, that if there is no sense of shared experience, of sympathy, in his language, of sympathy with each other, markets don't really work, because there is nothing to check that darker side of human beings. If we can't relate to one another as human beings, or make the attempt to understand how my actions will have a consequence on you, and I only see you as a means to making money, capitalism corrupts itself and becomes really tyrannical.
So is it sympathy checks the greed?
Yeah, and so, again, that's to be a bit reductive.
Yes,
Um,
and I am. Yes.
yeah, right. And so that's not. I mean, again, he has 600 some odd pages on this.
Yeah. Oh, like
Um,
come on, you should have just done it my one sentence
right, in
way,
one
Adam
sentence, right?
Smith.
But sort of the idea is that because we have a natural sympathy for each other, that we can see suffering and that we can suffer together. Um, the contemporary thinker Peter Singer picks up on this, where the concentric circles idea, that you want to expand the things that you empathize with.
Mm,
Um, that Singer's argument, his argument takes it, we should even be empathizing with sort of really smart animals.
mm,
Um,
mm-hmm,
Smith's argument doesn't go there,
mm,
but the logic is similar. Singer is drawing or borrowing from Smith in this way,
mm.
um, that capitalism has to be checked by that moral instinct or that moral sentiment. In terms of politics, uh, the goal, where I think we often understand or misunderstand, at least again in the American context, because I don't know Canadian politics or British politics, or I don't know them well enough. You can't be an expert in everything.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the sort of the American idea, the goal of good governance is not legislation; it's the denial of tyranny.
Mm.
And so the purpose of setting these things against each other is to say, if you get a tyrannical Congress, you have a president that can check it. If you get a tyrannical president, you have a Congress or the court that can check it. Because ultimately, the goal of the Constitution is to prohibit.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to allow. That's not really its purpose. And that
Mm-hmm.
shifts in the 20th century. Again, we can go down that rabbit hole, but it shifts. And now we see it as sort of bad. A good Congress is one that produces a lot of legislation, or any government. We just want them to work, right?
Mm.
Just produce something. Well, what happens if what they're producing is really stupid?
Mm.
Right? Or worse, what they're producing is tyrannical, which is not good. So the underlying thing is not necessarily the production of legislation. That's necessary for governance, right? We shouldn't completely deny. But at the ultimate thing, the reason you have a constitution, or their argument is the reason you have a constitution, is to stop a tyrant, in whatever form or wherever they were to emerge. Because their
Oh.
concern is ultimately with, like, there's never been a democracy or a republic that's lasted. They all burn out. If you want a really long-lasting regime, you set up a monarchy, like a hereditary, long-lasting monarchy. They last for centuries. Like,
Okay, that leads me to the question of why do they burn out then? Is it because we lose? Let me see if I kind of can understand what you're saying from before about sort of the pushback. Is it that the checks that were meant to keep the greed, I guess, and the tyranny in balance,
mm-hmm.
all themselves become tyrannical themselves, I
Right,
suppose?
or they can break down, right?
Okay.
And right, so that's the law problem, and that's where most liberal political thought, up until the present. The clearest or the most recent example of this is a guy named John Rawls, who's incredibly influential in political philosophy. He's also been really influential in arguments today on, I guess we can call them the identitarian left, the people who engage in
Mm-hmm.
social justice. They're using him without knowing they're using him, but that's fine.
That's
Or
yeah.
some of them do. Some of them give credit, but a lot of them don't. But it's about how do you make sure that those rules are the appropriate rules to counteract the way that they degrade.
Okay,
Um,
why do they degrade though?
because people break them. They break the rules, and if, especially once you start breaking rules and there aren't any consequences for the breaking of rules, why do I need to follow any rules? And so then, law only works as long as people follow it, and it's enforced. If you stop having people following it and stop having it be enforced, the whole thing dissolves. So, like, again, the founders, their argument about why do we need this written constitution, right, which is new, 220, 30 years ago, whatever,
Mm.
right? It's a new idea to write this stuff down. Why do we need to do this? Oh, because all of the ancient republics, they all fell to tyrants. Most of them fell to tyrants through democracy, which is unusual for us to think about, but
Mm.
democracy can be really destructive. Because if you set up the majority to tyrannize the minority, that's the stuff of revolutions. Um,
Mm.
and this is in some ways how Aristotle sees most politics working out, is conflicts between the rule of the minority and rule of the majority.
Mm.
And that sort of the best thing you can do is give both of them something to do. And so the modern approach is how do we make a government that doesn't rely upon the goodness of its people, except that they are willing to follow the law? Right. So that's back again to our virtue question.
Hmm.
Right. We don't have to rely on government to make people good. We just have to make sure that the people are good enough that they don't destroy the government, that they can handle. So for our instance, that they can be pluralists, that they can have their idea of what the good life is, or with their own religious structure or their own belief system, and let their neighbor have a different one and not have it
Ah.
cause war. Right. That's
But
the thing. That's
war is a brewing, perhaps, with the left and the right, it seems lately, with
um
regards to pluralism and allowing your brother to have, or
sure.
sister to have,
Right.
their own life.
I don't I don't know that I agree that it's brewing as much as people think. I think it's
Okay.
brewing a whole lot more in the pressure cooker of Twitter. Maybe the blue check marks will go to war with each other,
Mm.
but I think most people aren't, because most people don't live at that level. Um, but most people sort of everyday experiences: can I pay for my food? Can my kid go to school? Can I
Mm.
do these kinds of things? And yeah, there are arguments about ideas, and but they're far more I don't know, grayer. They're not, people aren't
Well,
as
they're not as
steadfast.
staunch. Yeah, they're. We see on Twitter and people at protests and, well, Portland. We see that
Right.
very obviously,
Yep.
but it it depends on where you live and what circle you run in and whatnot. And
Right.
also, I think it depends on if Trump gets reelected. I think that might
Yeah.
have to do
Maybe.
with.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I've never been a big fan of making predictions, because you always make an ass out of yourself when you
Mm-hmm.
do. So I do that enough without making predictions, so
Mm.
I don't. But I think in sort of the underlying logic, I guess, that's sort of building up. There's Mark Lilla has a book called The Once and Future Liberal, which is like, I don't know, 80 or 90 pages, that sets up a critique of identitarian
Mm-hmm.
left against sort of a traditional class-based left.
Mm-hmm.
And what he sort of points us to is that movement politics has replaced party politics. So people need to feel that they are an activist against a
Mm.
cause, more than they are a member of a party building a coalition. I'm fighting against whatever this evil is, because that's the thing that's really politically motivating me, not my identity as a political group.
Mm.
And by that, I don't mean the things that break down, like on sex and gender and race and those things. I mean, am I on this part of the political spectrum or that part of the political spectrum, recognizing that both of, or like, I mean, not everything is left right. We talk way too much in politics because of the American thing of left right, but like, there are a lot of parties in the world that are not left right or clearly delineated left
Well,
right.
I think of like a plus, or is it
Right,
plus, like up, down, right,
right.
left, like I guess authoritarian, libertarian, and
Yep.
then left, right.
Right, and then yeah, right, which is the right liberal or conservative, and then you play Battleship and find where you fit, and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, where I think to finish sort of the Lilla point, the reason I think that we see that politics is really sort of churning and feels very visceral.
Mm-hmm.
I say this to my students frequently, that when you take your headphones out and stop listening to your music, which is what we do like all day long,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we can block the world out and we can control the input, and who doesn't want that? If you take that out and you just sit outside for a second, there's sort of a visceralness that you can feel that one, you miss the thing that you were listening to or the thing you could control your device or whatever, because we're sort of addicted to these things.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also this sense that there's something off and that there's something that's going to change. We can't, there's a sort of ineffable feeling here. And there's a lot of anger, across the sort of the Western political spectrum. There's a lot of anger at a whole lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And where does this come from? It isn't just because of bad trade policy or, jobs or
Mm-hmm.
reputation or something like this. There's something deeper. And I think this is why Peterson has become really popular, because
Mm.
he's sort of asking us to think about that. How do you relate to your own anger, and to this kind of stuff? And how do you conquer that and whatever? Or if you can't conquer it, how do you wrestle with it? Where the way I think about it or approach it is, that anger, it tends to make us think that we are far more at odds with each other than we are. Because for the most part, who thinks that they want to live in a way that's not how we live? And I would say this to anyone who is sort of a revolutionary that's on the left, or a contrarian that's on the right, or if you're a Pepe Frog shitpost or whatever these people are, whatever revolution you're going, what's the thing that's better than how you're currently living, except for your idiosyncratic experience, because sometimes those things are always bad. But we don't execute public intellectuals we disagree with, right? This isn't. There's not going to be a modern Socrates. We're not going to kill them. Well, if we start doing that, then the experiment, the project's over. We don't. Religious civil wars are very, very unlikely now. Extremely unlikely. Like in our countries, there haven't been any, and there haven't been class civil wars. We don't really animate people enough not to be willing to die, but to be willing to kill someone else. That takes a lot out of somebody, and purposefully, right? Calculating to take up a weapon and calculate and go shoot somebody. That's not, unless there's something wrong, right?
Well, I'm thinking of like jihadis and things like that.
Right. Well, because you're going to get a reward for all the people you're killing, right? And so that's one way that you can overcome this sort of liberal character that we have had to cultivate. And I guess this, again, to double back on the very first question you asked me, why do I think these things are connected? Liberalism, or modern liberal political theory, on its face says we don't have to rely on the character of the people, but we very much have to. There is a certain character we have to cultivate in the people. And I talk about this in a little bit in another piece that I wrote for Areo magazine on James Madison and the 10th Feathers, that you have to cultivate people for tolerance. Toleration is something we have to cultivate. It's not something we naturally have. And this is my criticism of Shapiro and Patrick Deneen, who I referenced earlier. Toleration can sometimes feel kind of icky, but we're not killing each other, and that's something that's you can't say for a lot of human history, that we've sort of reached this equilibrium, and that's why I'm not sure, even with the incredibly flared tensions and the hyper partisanship and these bubbles and burps of violence or demonstration or protest, the argument would have to be, no, we need people to be less tolerant than they are. And who's going to argue for that? The argument is you have to go from being tolerant to being accepting. That's sort of the argument that's going on the left. And on the right, the argument is, well, how much do we need to tolerate in the public square versus how much do we tolerate in the private sphere? And sort of that's the argument. But both of them are arguing about toleration, because in some ways that's the heart of the modern project. And so anybody who's going to fight against it, well, what are you going to replace it with? What? And it's
well, isn't that kind of like going back to like the Nietzsche's God is dead and you killed him? What are we replacing?
Right.
These. I guess it's cultivating virtue. The stories cultivate virtue in people. Is that, or I guess make you want to reach for a virtuous life?
Well, or they give us the way to talk to each other,
Okay.
right?
Oh, back to the speech and the
Exactly.
mythos and logos together
Right.
means ways of speaking in two
Right.
different
That's right.
veins.
Right. Exactly. And they speak to it because fundamentally, like reason, um, we often want to talk about reason as if it's disconnected from our emotional condition.
I think
And
that's a
again,
big problem. Yes.
but that's not, it's not true. We can reason about our emotions, and this is a big argument that goes on in philosophy, or has for a long time. What's the relationship? Should reason control the emotions? Should the emotions be dictating to reason? You get that like in Hume and in Hobbes. The ancients, it's sort of, you have to have reason to govern everything, but governing everything doesn't mean that you deny or diminish or starve them. And that's where we get into some problems today, which is, you just need to be completely rational, sans any emotional response. Well, human beings don't live that way.
Mm.
Um, I think the clearest example of this, the trolley car thing from philosophy, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Do you kill the one big fat guy or the five kids?
mm-hmm.
And the answer, and I, I always loathe to say this, but the answer is sort of like, well, it depends on if you're related to one of them.
Oh, I
If
didn't think about that.
right, if the big guy, the one guy over there is your dad, those kids are dying, right?
Mm.
Because that's how human beings make our choices.
We're not
And,
pure, right? Yeah, we're not pure reason when it comes to who we love.
right, well, exactly, and
Mm.
because our kin connections frequently trump everything,
Mm.
um, and there's an evolutionary reason for that, certainly. But if that's part of our nature, then it probably means that our morality is also connected to it. Um, the French thinker Montesquieu has this phrase where he's talking about how maybe in a perfect world, people would make decisions without taking into consideration their friends and their families. The problem with this is not that it would be impossible to create, but it would be impossible to think of it as a human world.
Right, it would be
That
robotic almost.
Right, exactly. You would destroy everything that's good about being human in doing this, because we don't make our decisions disconnected from all of those other interests. Maybe it would be better if we did. I'm not sure. I don't know that it actually would be, because you could result in all kinds of absurd situations where the moral choice is to kill your own family, right?
Have you heard of The Giver, the
Yeah, I know
book?
of it. I've never read it,
Yes.
and it's a movie too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
and
is.
it's
Yeah, yes. And it like you have family units that are you're put together,
yep,
but you have a serum that you take every morning, then it makes you not have, I guess, don't really have like any sort of romantic or sexual feelings. So the mother unit and the father of the unit are they're not together. They just are inhabiting, and they're assigned kids.
right,
And yeah, and that sounds like what you're describing almost, right? And
right,
it's and their world is completely reason based.
right.
And
Yeah, and I call it disembodied reason, right?
mm,
Free floating without. And what's interesting about this is you also see this developing again on that identitarian left, where we get to restructure pronouns and gender because of the way our reason tells us to go, to affirm the way that we feel about ourselves.
are they
But
using reason though?
well, I don't know what else it would be. um,
Isn't it? Okay, so this is actually good because of the bias I have towards. I don't think that they're correct, and I think that there is sort of reason in, say, scientific method, and
mhm.
they are, oh no, there's experience is truth alongside of, and so
Right,
I sort
right.
of, I guess, have a bias against them. So
Mm.
I thought that they were thinking with their hearts and
Yeah,
what rather than their heads. So
right. Right. So so where I think about that, or the way I approach this, again, I don't study this, so I should probably put that as a caveat. Everything I think could be totally wrong,
oh, that's
um,
me all the time,
or,
like on
or
this
or
show.
or even the stuff that I do study, I can be completely wrong on all
Okay.
that too. But, the way the way at least I understand it, the best to my understanding is, um, What you're trying to do is realign yourself to align to the way you understand who you are, and that your body does not conform to that understanding. So I'm going to change or construct a new identity that affirms my understanding of myself. That's a
And
rational process,
okay, so
right?
you're using reason. Okay, sorry, I cut you off.
Right.
This you were saying that's a rational process.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
right. And now it may be
like
more
over
akin.
rationalizing, maybe.
Well, so here's the question, and I don't have an answer for this. I just have a question on it. Is this reason that's used in, and I'll say like in the Humean or the Hobbesian way, where you're using reason to affirm your emotions, right? That reason is the handmaiden of the passions, is how Hume refers to it,
Mm.
and or is it that your reason sits beyond the boundaries of your body, which means it's disconnected, it's disembodied from the rest of you. So those emotions are toiling and doing their thing underneath. And what your reason is so powerful is it gets to say, I get to actually regulate all of those things because I'm disconnected from them. I think it speaks to, it appears to be irrational on the outside, I think, but it actually seems to say that no, all we are is our rationality. It may not be reasonable. And I
Mm.
think there's a gap to be said there, but it may be speaking completely that no, if everything is socially constructed, well, what part of us does the social construction? Uh,
Mm.
right? It's the rational part of us, because that's the only thing. Otherwise, you'd have to say that all animals are also just engaging in social construction, but that leads us down the biology route, and they don't want to go there, right?
Mm.
It's a big problem. So you have to disembody the reason. It's just you're using the reason to affirm something about the body that you conceive of yourself. I don't actually know. I think there's an inherent contradiction in it.
Mm.
It's either everything's fundamentally socially constructed, or you're affirming or you're correcting or adjusting, or I don't know the exact word here. You are aligning, properly aligning what your body and your mind should be. They were born incorrectly. I'm fixing that. On the one
Okay.
hand, the argument that all gender is sort of performative and constructed. On the other hand, no, what we're doing is we are affirming our gender identity to our physical identity, or we're making our physical identity match our gender identity.
Okay.
Those are two different claims, two different understandings of the power of reason. And I think that there's a big internal thing. I don't spend my time on this,
Right.
and I don't, because I don't understand it. I'm not going to try to.
Mm.
I'll leave this to people who are doing psychology and that kind of stuff. I'll let them do
Right.
this. But just as sort of a person looking on the outside, this seems that they're having a big argument about the nature of reason,
Mm.
and what role it is. On the one hand, it affirms the long-handing tradition of reason since like Descartes of mind-body dualism, that there's disconnected, which would be
Mm.
everything is socially constructed. But then the other side, reason is sort of playing handmaiden to the passions, which puts you in with someone like David Hume or Hobbes, big
Okay.
critics of Descartes. Both of them are part of the modern liberal tradition, intellectually anyway.
So are you saying that they're the like say those are the gender dysphoria thing is using both or one or
I,
the other?
I think that the arguments around it, often those things are used as though they're interchangeable, and I think they're actually a contradiction.
Oh,
Um,
okay. Oh, I see. Sorry, it took me a moment to get there, but
no, it's all good.
I
Yeah,
see.
I may not have been good because I don't fully understand it.
Mm.
It's something I'm full of questions, and I hope maybe someone that's watching or something can send and go, "This is a really good essay on this. Read this. It
Mm.
explains this." That would be terrific. But
Well,
yeah,
I actually just yeah, I just finished editing an interview I did with James Lindsay and Mike Nana about
uh,
the grievance studies rhetoric, and like we're
yep.
getting down deep into the rhetoric of it, you know.
Hmm.
And so it's not in the psychological bit that you're talking about, but in the theological, like what did they believe, if that
Hmm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's almost like iterations of like different levels that you go, and yeah, it's hard. Deconstructing it is, I need to do more research because I even rewatching it as I was editing, I took notes because I'm like,
Mm.
oh, remember that, even though you literally talked about it, and this is the second time you're learning it. So anyway, it is very interesting. And is it okay? Would you say, with regards to the potential breakdown of democracy that has been listed with the, what was that book, The Fall of Liberalism? The
Um, what, the end of
the end
liberalism?
of liberalism.
Yeah,
Yeah, that kind of
yeah.
describes that it is democracy has a denaturing, I guess, where eventually it sort of breaks down.
Yeah. So
Are we there though? That's my question. Are we there?
um, his argument is certainly we're going there. I don't know that I don't know.
Right? You don't like making predictions, right?
And yeah, so it's where I'll ground this back, I guess, in my training, and this is the book he's drawing from again, Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, which he writes in 1831. And if you ever want to feel bad about yourself as a grad student somewhere, he wrote this when he's in his late 20s, and it's the most seminal book on democracy that's probably ever been written. So
Okay.
it always makes me feel good about myself. um, it makes me think of the anecdote when Caesar goes to visit the grave of Alexander the Great, and Caesar's in his early 50s, and he looks at this and he starts to cry, and he
Like,
goes,
oh, you were 30.
yeah, and he goes, well, look at everything he accomplished in his life, and I am 50 and I will be of nothing. And it's like we still use his name today, as a political leader, a czar, as a Caesar.
Yeah.
Well, I guess everything's about perspective. But so the argument about democracy is Tocqueville lays out that there are certain things about democracy. It's defined by its liberty, it's defined by its equality or its desire for equality, and those two things really are in tension. And what his prediction in the text is that eventually what we're going to do is choose equality over liberty, that we would rather be equal than free. And
Well, that certainly is some rhetoric from the, I guess, applied postmodernists or the social justice left. That equality and equity is what is
right,
needed for things to be right in the world.
right. And Tocqueville's argument, or the continuation of it, is what you have to do is then have a centralized, what he calls a benign despotism that will regulate everything in your life, everything that you do and think or say, and that the way in which it will do it is through the tyranny of a majority and through the coercive power of the state. Because you have to, in this sense, force everyone to be equal.
Yes.
And not equal in the sense of having equal access to rights or having an equal ability to be free or liberty, and it's equal in the way of being the same. And because any distinction, what ends up happening is that distinction itself becomes unjust. And that's where he argues that that's one potential outcome for modern liberal democracy, is this kind of he calls it an immense tutelary power, where the state is teaching everyone to live in a certain kind of way, and you're not allowed to ask questions or think about it differently. John Stuart Mill has a similar concern On Liberty, where the tyranny of the majority, his concern is that the tyranny of the majority will force anyone who is not compliant to the majority to be silent. Right. And then in the culture, it's going to do that. In the government, it's going to, his concern is even less to the state. It's more through the culture.
Okay.
And that seems to be more with these, isn't that what they call them? The applied postmodernists or something like
that? That's what James Lindsay and his grievance study group calls them.
Yeah. And, these people who are doing the stuff from Judith Butler and the sort of the performative stuff and the subversive, irony, that kind of thing, and which they're getting from people like Foucault and stuff like that, and that what you end up doing, there is no system that is known to human beings that can stand up to radical skepticism. Nothing. The closest that we get to is the approximation we have in natural science, which is you have an idea, I'm going to set out to disprove you. Well, I can't do that, right? And so that's the closest we get. But even there, it's not stable. What's true yesterday is not guaranteed to be true tomorrow. There's a built-in instability. That's what allows for the progress Things which are too stable don't make progress. So you have built-in instability. And democracy has some of that too, especially when you attach democracy to the idea of a human progress, because progress has to have instability in it. Well, democracy is already unstable. It tends very frequently to centralize and to, well, like the word demagogue today is a bad word, but it has the same root as democracy, right? It's the demagogue is the leader of the people, and democracies elect demagogues. And it's a big problem because conservatives don't like democracy, so they don't like demagogues. And that's come down through the tradition to us. We don't like demagogues for that reason. But there's a deeper problem with it. By choosing a specific leader, you're actually undermining the purpose of having a democracy. There's a big tension in democracy and with leadership. We use that word, that's all over like the business world, right? And everybody's supposed to be a leader, and I'm cultivating leadership, and I've got my stupid posters on the wall and all this stuff. Well, either everyone's a leader, which means you don't need it, or only some people are, which means democracy has a problem. And Nietzsche points this out in one of his big criticisms of democracy. And you see this in Loki in the Avengers in the first movie, where he's talking about, isn't this the more natural condition for you to be on your knees and all this, and I'm supposed to be blah, blah, blah. And, no, screw you. We're not doing this, right? This is not how we are. But then we elect people who make promises about fixing everything for us.
Which sound right, which could...
It's a problem.
Yeah, how do you fix everything without demagoguery, I guess?
Exactly. That's right. And so there's something that's sort of a built-in problem in democracy for that it tends toward tyranny.
Okay, but you said you don't agree with the conclusions of, and I forget the author's name for that.
Patrick Deneen. Mm-hmm.
Okay, with Patrick. So why don't you kind of are making his argument sound pretty like it makes sense?
No, that's right. And I think that's why I think I called it's scathing.
Okay.
Because it does really strike. It's a body blow to the ideas of liberalism. But what it doesn't do or doesn't give enough credence to is the idea that we've cultivated tolerance. And when you apply toleration to democracy, what you do, and Tocqueville also points this out, is that you moderate everything. So this is why it's a benign form of despotism instead of a tyrannical or a destructive form. It's not one that's designed to make slaves out of the people. It's just meant to make them slavish.
Now, what if we turn to cultivating virtue alongside the tolerance? Maybe this would be a good space to end on.
Sure.
I guess kind of what you're doing. Let's reach back to the ancients and what their definition of freedom or living in a virtuous manner was. So, I guess.
This is tougher. Jonathan Haidt tried to do something like this a few years ago in some of his works, and he's pointed to some of this. There's a big gulf between us and the ancient world, both in time and in the way we conceive of ourselves. There's the idea of virtue. We'll use Aristotle because I have a tough time reducing, like, the ancient world was just as varied and complex as ours is. So there are a lot of people that have vastly different, disagreements on stuff, and there's a really rich tradition there. And we usually boil it down to like 2 books from 2 guys. And so it's like saying that all of modernity was sort of John Locke and Adam Smith and everybody else didn't matter.
Right.
So that's fair. But here, for our purpose, we'll go to Aristotle, and his idea of sort of developing culture or virtue is really there are 11 virtues that define a good human life, and there is an excess or a deficiency of each one. The issue with us, our sort of modern notion, is that everyone has access to those things. Everyone has the capacity to be virtuous. And Aristotle's argument is really not really. You have to have a certain disposition toward certain things, and those you're born with. Some people just don't have one of his virtues is liberality, meaning to give things away. if you're poor, you don't have stuff to give away. You can't give back to the city
Mm.
if you don't have the means to do so. And so you're sort of cut off from that. And so there's no way for you to engage in that kind of virtue. But even let's leave that problem aside.
Okay.
And let's say that we do, in the modernity, we have the access to do all of them, right?
Mm.
The issue there is it's exceptionally hard. Two, you have to start at like infancy with like children to cultivate. How do you cultivate courage in someone who's never been presented with danger? Or whose danger has never resulted in anything that can harm them? So Haidt's work is sort of pointing us in that direction.
I'm thinking of The Coddling of the American Mind a bit, which I know was the answer to his previous book, which was like The Righteous Mind, right?
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. And I'm not sure that there's an answer. They're talking to each other.
I know. I just remember his points sort of are the one is the antithesis of the other.
Yeah,
his point he mentions.
So courage is like the first one that Aristotle lays out, and in some ways perhaps is the most important, because speaking publicly is a dangerous enterprise, not just physically but for your honor. Because if you say something stupid, people go, "You're an idiot," and you're branded this way. And that only really works when you have a place or a people who work in shame. Or where shame has a currency. And the clearest example we see of that, the re-rise of that, is again on that identitarian side of the left. Shame is a huge currency there because what they're really doing is posturing for or positioning themselves for honor. That makes a little bit more sense going back to the ancient world than the other side of the left, or even the conservative part of liberalism, where they don't give a lot of credence to honor. And that's why they don't really, they're not talking to each other because they're not actually speaking the same language.
Right.
And so, but let's say, we're going to cultivate this into people and what means you have to be given the opportunity to show those virtues. And that's where the issue arises sort of in the modern versus the ancient context. If you don't have a society which lets you show your courage, how do you ever have courage?
Well, how?
Right, but you can't. That's the problem.
Okay.
Is that there are limits that are set by the regime you live in, and that's sort of Aristotle's political theory that, or one of the major components is, the horizon of your life is determined by the horizon of the place you live, and so that intuitively kind of makes sense. If you live in an autocratic regime or an authoritarian one, the kind of life you can live is very different than the one in a free society. The issue in the free society is we're not entirely sure what kind of life we're supposed to live. And it's built by design that way. Because
of freedom.
Because of our understanding of freedom, that's right.
Okay, well, it kind of seems... Yeah, it kind of seems like we need something... We need to learn what those virtuous traits look like today and how we can demonstrate them in our current context, that a way that is successful in demonstrating these, because like you said, we can't demonstrate them in the same way.
So I think I won't say I disagree with you because that sounds lovely, but I think I disagree a little bit.
Okay.
Where I think that where we have to go is not necessarily in cultivating the virtues. What we have to do first is cultivate a similar enough culture where we understand what they are. And the first thing that
I agree with you. I actually disagree with myself now. Because no, this is like a defining the terms.
Yeah, well, but even more, yes, but defining it in such a way where the real core, and this I guess is sort of the core of what my dissertation is looking at, so it's on my mind a lot. How do we make people who are dissimilar to one another empathize, have pity with people who are different enough from them, but not so different that we see them as the other? And pluralism really stretches that for us. It really stretches our capacity or you just go to the species, right? Everyone is the same because they're human beings. But again, that's not how we live. We live at the kin level. We live at the tribe level or at the locality, right? And so that's where the most important stuff in our life happens. It's not at the species level. There are important things that happen there, more and more so now as we go through time, and we become more of a global society. But so we're at sort of this boundary point there, and this is actually what drove me to back into the ancient world, is that tension. Yes, I'm a human being, but I'm also, for me, I'm an American citizen, and I live in here, and I live this, and this is my family, and here's where this is. That whole ladder is full of tension. Because which one am I the most loyal to? And how far up that ladder can I go and still recognize some of me in someone else, where I can laugh with them at the same thing and cry for them for the same experiences? And where I think we are breaking down, and why I think we feel this sort of deep civil tension, or the maybe of a conflict coming, the empathy is ossifying.
Okay.
It's not plastic enough where I can take the other person's perspective and say, this would be devastating to me if this happened. I think that's where we have to go first.
Okay, and so and if I said, okay, so how you're writing your dissertation still, so
it's through our storytelling.
Okay, we're going back there. Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
That's what it is. Yep.
Well, I mean, I could continue, but I think that will be another time. When you finish your dissertation, we will do a whole hour on storytelling then.
That'd be terrific. That'd be terrific.
Oh, this was so good. Thank you so much for
thank you
this,
for having me.
Stephen.
This was great. I had a good time. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I did too. I learned so many things. Okay, thank you.